Welcome back to Adherent Apologetics, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As always, we are brought to you by you with your support on patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics. Today, I am here with Kevin Harris. He is the co-host of the Reasonable Faith podcast with a guy some of you may know named William Lane Craig. But I mean, Kevin might know. I think he knows a little bit more than William Lane Craig, if I don't say so myself. But Kevin, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, Zach. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. I'm really pumped to talk to you. Just a little quick rundown for everyone listening. We're just going to be talking a little bit about just some general apologetics things and also about Kevin's work with Dr. Craig. So we're going to kind of mix and mash here for the next 45 minutes or so. And if you're listening to us live, as always, we'll be doing a little bit of Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask your questions. But to start, Kevin, I'm curious if someone doesn't know who you are, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, my career has been in music production and in radio, and I've been in radio since I was in high school. And I've always tried to figure out in the last 10 to 15 years or so, especially, how can I combine my skills in radio and production and my love for apologetics? How can I combine that somehow into a way that would effectively utilize my skills in both? And so that's what I've been trying to do for several years now. What's weird is that the state of radio, terrestrial radio, is just in flux. Nobody knows where it's going. Yeah. And none of us anticipated the internet. I've worked in major markets. I worked in Dallas, Fort Worth. I worked at Q102 Cincinnati, and been in some big markets. Nobody saw this coming, that there would come a time when there would be a different way to deliver content digitally and so on. And so radio is kind of weird right now. I mean, you can be on the air and also online at the same time. But I may be getting ahead of myself. I'll tell you why we're only online with Dr. Craig here in just a bit. But anyway, that's been my career.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that at some point. But I think one thing that's interesting, you talked about you've had this passion for apologetics for the past 10, 15 years. So maybe you could walk through a little bit of your story and what got you interested in apologetics and these big questions in the first place.
Well, yeah. And that goes all the way back to high school. I got a hold of a copy just by sheer accident when I was 18 years old of Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And that launched so many of us, so many people into the apologetics task. But I'll never forget it. When I got to page 4, I was electrified. I was hooked. I said, you know what? We got to get the word out, because bubbling, and I was really plugged into my youth group, had a strong relationship with the Lord, the whole bit. Contemporary Christian music was starting to happen, it was the 70s. People these days just kind of take it for granted, man. There wasn't anything until 74, 75, really. At least when we discovered it, and all that was going on. And bubbling down inside of me was, okay, I know that this all makes sense. My faith in Christ makes sense intellectually, but I didn't know anything about defending the faith, apologetics, and the intellectual grounding and the evidential grounding and so on of my faith. I knew it was there. I just didn't know what to call it. And I didn't know how to articulate it. And so really, God was very gracious to me to get a hold of that book before I went through what some of my friends have gone through. And that is a period of doubt where you had to start digging in and you go through this agonizing doubt. And then God bails you out of that, via use of good apologetics and just gives you grace for those intellectual questions. I mean, Dr. Lacona, he went through a period of doubt. Gary Habermas has gone through periods of doubt, but God knew me well enough, I guess, that he just kind of let me bypass that. And I get the information before I get a chance to struggle with it. That's usually the way it is. But that book set me on fire. It just set me on fire, you know.
Yeah, it's amazing. So when you were looking at kind of like these reasons and these evidences and things like that, what really did you find compelling in terms of maybe just the existence of God, and then you can move on to Christianity?
Yeah. It started with just how compelling the person of Jesus was, and the fact that the New Testament was historically accurate and was reliable, and we could trust it. I didn't have any idea that there were so many manuscripts, by which we could compare, and just the wealth of textual criticism information that we have. So that just set me on. I mean, I was not a good student up to that point, but that also turned my mind on, and I began to want to study history, literature, art, the humanities, archaeology. So it flipped a switch in me, and I love to see that happen, because I see that happen all the time with people. It's just like God flips his switch. So that was, I think that's one of the first things that struck me, was that the New Testament was reliable, and that we had an accurate account of what Jesus taught, a tradition of his sayings, and that he was captured accurately within the Gospels. And from there, I started looking at philosophical evidences for the existence of God, and this was in the 70s, man. I mean, we're talking a long time ago.
Was it that long ago though? I don't know. Don't make yourself sound old,
Yeah.
No, but it is amazing how one thing I thought about here is the idea of like flipping a switch when you can dive into these things. I've seen this like in my own life. I've gone from reading like 5 books a year to like 50. It's amazing how these things can just change our perspective on literally everything. So you're in radio, you've been looking at these questions from the 70s, from the 1970s. So could you like kind of walk through like how do you get to where you are today, where you're like the co-host of like the Reasonable Faith podcast with William Lane Craig and all these things? Like what kind of brought you into that sort of realm, if you could say?
I've always felt that my calling, and not everybody can embrace this. You need to look at just how you are bent, how you're created, what God has given you, your giftings and your callings and so on. I've always wanted to be salt and light in the mainstream. I see a lot of value in people of faith and taking the good news about Jesus into the mainstream. I didn't want to be in Christian radio. Not really. I've been in Christian radio, and it's great. I'm not knocking it at all. It's just that every time I've tried to be in it, I haven't felt like it's where I needed to be. And so I've been in mainstream rock radio, top 40, mainstream talk. And because I think that's where we need to be. I think we need to be salt and light in there. And that takes some discipline, and it takes being plugged in with a lot of support, fellowship, things like that from your local church to keep you grounded. So I've always wanted to do that, and I've always wanted to also figure out how to get apologetics into the mainstream, so that people who had intellectual roadblocks to faith in Christ, we could knock those down, that they could deal with those, and say, yeah, okay, took care of that roadblock. So, but it's very hard to do. I mean, how am I going to do that in music, radio, and everything? And so I've tried to have little side projects, but how it came about with Dr. Craig was I had philosophy and theology talk show on a radio station in Austin, Texas, and did it every Saturday. And Dr. Craig was a frequent guest. Finally, one day I called him up and I said, Dr. Craig, you need to have your own radio show. And you need to call it we need to call it Reasonable Faith. We need to be on the radio and get on as many stations as we can. Get on Christian radio, get on secular radio, and get some of this scholarly stuff down to the lay level. That doesn't mean dumb it down. It just means to make it accessible to the lay person. And he agreed, and he said, let's do it. Our initial idea was to be on radio, but a consultant talked to Dr. Craig and said, you know what, you need to be on podcast instead. So I said, what? No. But that's the way it's worked out. And there are possibilities that we could even actually go on terrestrial radio, because terrestrial radio still has about a 94 to 96% reach of America. People still listen to the radio, even though it's undergoing a lot of changes. But I didn't see this coming, but that we would be podcasting and that we'd be doing video and YouTube. But that's the direction we went a little over 10 years ago. And so we started doing these. But I'll tell you quickly, I was interacting online in the mid-90s when the internet first started happening, and all the billboards, and the debate boards and the chat rooms and all that stuff. And we would get on there and do apologetics, and evangelism, and make a lot of friends and tangle up with the atheist. And all the atheists, I noticed, were talking about a man named William Lane Craig. And they said, if you want to answer Christianity, you're going to have to deal with him. And I go, well, who is he? And some people sent me a link, and they sent me a video that he did. And then of a debate with Frank Zindler, who was supposed to be the champion atheist. This was in the 90s at Willow Creek Church. And then I attended a debate in the late 90s with Dr. Craig. 4,000 people were at this debate. And again, we were all electrified at what a good job he did, how gracious he was, and how well he dealt with some of the smartest atheists on the planet. And so I said, we need to do this. We need to do a podcast. We need to get on the radio and do this. That's how it happened.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. Something you brought up earlier is you guys, obviously, you're almost in radio by training, but you guys are exclusively on a podcast now with the Reasonable Faith podcast. So what's kind of like the rationale behind, I don't know if at some point you guys were on the radio, but now just focusing on the podcast platform with what you guys are doing?
We started exclusively on podcast. And the consultant that got Dr. Craig's ear and my ear at the time has turned out to be right. We had no idea that podcasts would be so popular. Yeah. We thought they'd be a little supplemental side thing, and that traditional radio and TV would continue to be the dominant force. And that's no longer, the case. Now, traditional media is still out there. And again, radio has a huge reach. 95% of the population, people still listen to radio. And millennials and some of the younger people are starting to rediscover radio, but it's always within using online sources as well. Yeah. I don't know where it's going to go. And my friends who've been in the industry for a long time, experts in this area, don't know what's going on. But what you're doing is the future, apparently, and that's what's happening. But we started out on podcast, and there are a couple of possibilities that we may actually take the podcast and edit them down, put them on radio as well. because you get out of the ghetto of the internet there, and you can pull more people in to your channel and to your podcast by utilizing some of the traditional forms of media that are still very strong.
Yeah. So I'm curious, obviously you come from like a radio perspective. Like, have you seen like the impact of like the internet, and you get these things like podcasts and YouTube? Obviously it seems, especially on YouTube, atheists kind of like jumped the gun here, and we're ahead almost in this whole debate for a few years. And we've seen a lot more Christian apologetics and philosophy podcasts and YouTube channels and all these things kind of spring up over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So like, what, in terms of that dynamic, like what have you seen on the internet, and how like it's almost like, in the history we'll have people who will be racing to colonize the lands or things like that. It's almost like there's something different but similar happening in like the Christian atheist dynamics. I'm curious if you have any thoughts like on what's going on here with like the internet and like information.
Oh man. Well, I noticed the same thing from the get-go. For some reason, when the internet started and we all plugged in and got online, and then it started expanding, I said, where did all these atheists and agnostics come from?
Yeah.
Because you're hanging around your hometown, going to church with your buds, and your family. You don't meet that many, and all of a sudden you realize there's jillions of them. And for some reason, they resonated with it, and they would say, well, it's because of the science and because of technology and because we're into that kind of thing. Well, so are we as believers in Christ, absolutely. But I noticed the same thing you did. But there were a few Christian websites that were out there, and they were ahead of the game. The first email I ever got was from my dad. The second email I got was from atheist Dan Barker. So that's how far he and I go back. And so there was a Matt Slick had CARM, CARM, Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry. And he really had a professional, slick-looking site and all the technology. He was ahead of the game. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people there. And I learned. I learned from interacting there. And it was a whole new world. Made a lot of friends to this day. But there were some fearsome battles. On that. I'll jump ahead just a little bit. The big thing at the time, and it seemed to occupy a lot of our time, was biblical inerrancy. When I look back, I think we wasted a lot of time trying to defend that, because we went round and round and round defending certain views of inerrancy. Now, I believe in inerrancy, and to this day, I'm amazed at how well the Bible holds up. Scrutinization and how well you can harmonize how Judas died. Did he hang himself? Did he fall headlong? And the whole thing. And but that's what they somehow saw, that the atheists and the agnostics and people of other faiths who are apologists for their faith, they thought that's where they really needed to go after us, because they thought that the Bible was vulnerable. They thought that there were too many problems with it. Now, it was a huge education, though. Again, it was a great Bible study to just see how it all hung together. Today, you don't see that quite as much, because even if certain doctrines of inerrancy aren't true, or they turn out not to be true, or Bible turns out to have some error or something like that, that doesn't destroy Christianity. That just might adjust to a doctrine of inerrancy, or it might undermine certain views of inerrancy and things like that. But for we spent a lot of time getting down to the nitty gritty on verses but we were pressured. We thought that it was all or nothing. We thought we had to defend inerrancy because everything would fall apart. It was house of cards, man. It would fall apart if they found one error in there.
Yeah.
Nah, and today you don't see that as much. A lot of apologists saying, I don't even hold to you certain doctrines of inerrancy. If you want to talk about that, go talk about it with somebody else. Let's get into the evidence for Jesus, the evidence for God, and so on. But that was some of the big battles that we had in the 90s and early 2000s.
So I'm curious, you talk about kind of like these battles that you'd seen happen in the 90s and 2000s, and obviously as someone who has been talking to one of the greatest philosophers in Christian thought today, you've seen kind of like the progression and like where these battles are being fought. So like, could you talk a little bit like where you think like the timeline of like where we are today, like where are the battles now versus like, I know you hinted at it already, but like how has the progression occurred from like way back when you started this and looking at these big battles to like now, like what's the difference?
Well, it's always been about the Kalam cosmological argument with Dr. Craig. And so undermining premise 1 or premise 2 took up a lot of cyberspace as we were doing this and Big Bang cosmology. And I think that I think we've won that battle, and it's not even talked about that much anymore. I mean, you'll still run into it, a little bit, but the premises are really solid. Cosmology of it is just really solid in that argument. And while there are people who have some good objections, and there's a lot of study, that's what's so great about that argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, is it's very deep, very rich, very wide, and a lot to discuss in that. But it's held up really well, and so I don't see that as much. And this is just anecdotal. It used to be you'd be there. Now, for some reason, and maybe we can talk to Mike Jones and some others. The soul, neurology and the soul, neuroscience, and the existence of the soul seem to be the future. The mind, consciousness, mind-body dualism. I think for the next several years, we're going to see an increase in that as we seem to have moved away from, defending every form of inerrancy to the premises of the cosmological argument, the design argument, everything, even the moral argument, I think is held up so well that it's moved on a little bit. So neuroscience and the soul, consciousness, I think is what we're going to see. And boy, that's some heavy stuff. Mind, body, dualism.
Yeah, dualism and idealism. There's a lot there, and it's amazing. I remember I heard Dr. Josh Rasmus, another Christian philosopher, talking about he's done so much work on like contingency, but he even said that this like mind-body problem, I think he's a dualist, like he sees that as the most powerful argument for the existence of God. And it's gonna be really interesting where that goes. I've been reading the Quantum Enigma, and I'm just like, my mind is blown with like, for a while I thought science was explaining more and more, but when you get down and down and down into like the quantum level, there's so much there that's just a mystery. I was talking with one of my best friends who's studying physics, and he's like, yeah, if we look at this from a naturalist perspective, we have absolutely no idea what's going on here. No one does. And it's so interesting where it's going to head, especially in that issue in the next few years.
Start with JP Moreland. I mean, get your JP down. On mind body dualism, and you can go further than as far as you want to go with JP, because he's written reams and reams on it, but he also has some good introductory stuff as far as mind body dualism, substance dualism, property dualism, consciousness and the soul, and things like the mind and the soul. So that's just a suggestion. A lot of people who are watching right now are going, man, I'm way beyond that. But if you're just starting, he's really got some good stuff. Obviously.
Yeah, I mean, he has The Soul, a very 200-page introduction book for the beginners, and he also has the Entering the Blackwell Companion on the argument for the soul. So he's got a little bit for everyone. I'm curious. So you've been doing this podcast with Reasonable Faith for around 10 years, I believe, if I'm right. And you've done a lot, you've worked a lot on it. I'm curious, for someone who's growing, I guess this would include myself, someone who's trying to get their message out there to promote apologetics in one sense, especially in the podcast realm. What kind of advice could you give to someone if they try to build a ministry or something like that as we dive into these apologetic questions?
Oh, just let it blow your mind, just let it blow your mind and expand your head, because that's what happens. Someone told me that they thought that there was a resurgence of men back to the church because of apologetics, that for some reason it really resonates with the guys. And they were so excited about their faith, some of them for the first time in their lives, because of apologetics and the work of apologetics, that they actually, we've seen them coming back to church the last several years. But then the ladies are getting on board too. You got Mama Bear Apologetics and some great sources there. So it's not just a man thing by any stretch. So I'd recommend just let it. Here's another thing I recommend, because this is what's been really cool for me. Let God direct you, have a hand in what you need to know, because I have found that when you're sensitive to that some questions that you didn't even know existed, that somebody's either going to ask you, or you're going to run into online, or somebody's going to throw at you, or something like that. I have found many times that when that happens, 3 or 4 days earlier, I had just read something on it.
Yeah.
And so discipline yourself, read, and ask God to just energize your mind. And I want to say that you can't lose your temper. You've got to be patient with people. We're going through a time in American history where civil discourse is going out the window, and that's got to change. We've got to reverse that. Dr. Craig has been exemplary in this area by being kind, firm, professional, but going after arguments, tearing down arguments, not tearing down people, which is exactly what 2 Corinthians 10 says to do. We tear down arguments, but we don't tear down people. And these days, civil discourse is hard to come by. People want to shout you down, cancel you, yell at you, interrupt you, and would rather you not be heard at all. Forget the First Amendment, forget all views being on the table so that we can all examine and reason together. So that will backfire, because the very people who will shout you down, they themselves will get shouted down. And so it's a self-destructive thing on college campuses, because if your tribe can shut somebody down, then the next bigger tribe can shut you down, and we'll never have any discourse. And so firm but polite and civil, respect. I would say those two things. Obviously, you want to study and interact with people. And if you don't know the answer to something, say, you know what, that's a good question. Let me dig into that a little bit, and let's discuss it again. Can you meet next Thursday at 10 a.m. Starbucks, whatever. Yeah. Then you've got a legitimate relationship going on. And you're never in a relationship with someone just to win them, to have another apologetics notch on your belt. People will see right through that. That's patronizing. That's just that's not genuine. It's not authentic. Have authentic, genuine, honest relationships with people, and discuss these things. but you don't befriend somebody just so that you can win them over to your view or whatever, and then have a little notch on your belt,
Yeah.
And so, people are people. They're not, little trophies to collect.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's something I've seen in my own life is a lot of my friends and people I know that are non-believers. It's so important to build those relationships with them. So you've worked with Dr. Craig for a long time now. I'm curious, like if there's some like takeaways, things that you've learned from Dr. Craig. Maybe they're like philosophical or theologically related. Obviously, I'm sure there's a few of those. You can learn a lot from Dr. Craig, but also just like practically, like what have you learned in your experiences from working with Dr. Craig?
Wow. Well, oh my goodness.
Easy question.
Yeah, I've tried to figure out how to make room in my brain and just kind of chronicle, all of it. Obviously, I read his material, and my job is to, if he says ontological, my job is to say, now, what does that mean? If anybody is not familiar with that term, so. Again, not to dumb it down, but to make it accessible to the layperson.
Definitely.
So I will act as a layperson for the most part in this podcast. And I'm also acting as a student. So I'm sitting here soaking it up. I have learned a lot, and learned a lot about philosophy. I'm impressed as well with how disciplined that he is. He really just 6 a.m. does this, 7 a.m. does this, 8 a.m. And his beautiful wife, Jan, is probably a big part of that because she has really helped get him organized. Philosophers, musicians, we tend to be on cloud nine and can't get ourselves organized. So she's been a true blessing to him, helping him get organized. And it's inspired him to do so. And in fact, I had to come along because I'm kind of scattered all over the place, and I had to get real disciplined even to get these podcasts researched and done. What we do is we'll go into the studio for 2 days and we'll record about 25 or 30 podcasts.
Oh, wow.
So I got to come up with 50 topics and research them prior to these podcasts. And I say 50 because he'll throw out about 20 of them and go, So I come up with some additional things. And he tries to stay in his lane too. I mean, everybody wants to know sociological questions, social justice. What do you think about Antifa and things like that? And he resists that because he's trying to stay in his area of expertise, and so, which is, a smart thing to do. But at the same time, he's a leader and people want to know his opinion on these things. So I'll force him sometime to say, I need you to comment on it. I have learned a lot. I'll mention this real quick. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I lost my son. He was 18 years old. Tanner was 18. He was a senior in high school. We lost him in a motorcycle accident. That was 2015. And since that time, I have struggled just as part of the grieving process and God's grace to my concentration has been really bad because it's traumatic. I have not finished a book. No, I finished one book since 2015. I used to read 2 or 3 a month. And so I'm trying to ramp back up and get that back. Dr. Craig has been a real encouragement in that. But, N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. I started that and it's taken me forever. I think that's an 800-page book because when you go through the loss of a child, or you go through something traumatic like that, it can affect your concentration and some other things, and you have to ramp back up, build back up to that. And so it's been very, very difficult. Now I'm behind on my reading because of that. And so I've got a lot of catching up to do. And so what I'm saying is, be sure that you're getting a hold of some good material and some good books, and don't just read Wikipedia. Read what the scholars are saying, and keep advancing, on that. And so I'm trying to get my mojo back, but it's taken a few years.
I do want to say, obviously, I'm sure you've heard this many times, but I am so sorry for your loss. I had a friend who was 18 years old pass away a few years ago, and just seeing what it took on his family, I can only imagine the pain, and praise God for bringing you to where you are today. I just want to say that. So
God gives you grace when you need it. And when it happened, when we lost him, I felt like I was falling, but I landed smack dab in front of a 2.5-3 ton stone in front of an empty tomb. And so it's just been amazing how, despite pain and despite that grieving process, we don't grieve without hope. We grieve, yes, but we don't grieve without hope. And so there's a deepening and an enriching that comes along from that. But losing a child is as bad as they say. It's hard. But man, if God can get you through that, he can get you through anything. And I'm telling you right now, he does. He'll even get you through that. It's amazing. It's amazing. Thanks.
Praise God.
What you said. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you brought up like the podcast process for a little bit. You'll meet with Dr. Craig and churn out like 25 to 50 podcasts. So take out 20. Like, I'm curious, like, if you could elaborate a little bit more on like, what does that process look like? Because I think that's so interesting, because I don't think I realized at this point that you just will meet together for a couple of days and just churn out podcasts for 2 straight days. Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah. And I want to, and the technology is getting to the point now, I want to do more live things with Dr. Craig, like we're doing here. So we can get into super chat and some things like that. And that's going to start happening. And, live call in on radio, and then live interaction here, with Q&A, and things like that. So I do want to see that happen. But what I do is you have to weed through a lot of stuff. I mean, it can get you really depressed reading what people without Christ are saying, because it really is, when it comes down to it, very hopeless. Even though they're trying to be positive, it's not. I'm sorry, it's just not. And so weeding through a lot of the atheist blogs, agnostic blogs, will give me a lot of good questions and good stuff. And I've made some good friends too. Some of the atheist bloggers, as I've interacted with them, but they have a lot of good material. They're dealing with a lot of social justice and social issues right now, rather than the science and philosophy that where Dr. Craig specializes. And so it's hard, because he really doesn't want to do too much on that, but he's kind of being forced to do it. We're kind of having to put on our sociologist hat, a little bit. Try not to get political, but man, everything is so political these days. So anyway, I'll peruse that. And I'll tell you another cool thing, Zach, is that people send me either through Facebook, and I'll give my email here at the end. People send me topics and stuff I would never know about, that I just hadn't run into. But so people have really contributed and said, I'd really like to see you guys do a podcast on this article, and send me a link, or this meme. You notice a lot of people are saying, how do we answer this meme? We've got a lot of bumper sticker theology out there these
Yeah.
days. Memes have become the new bumper stickers, on the back of your car. So all the atheist bloggers, like the Friendly Atheist, and those guys, I'll keep an eye on what they're talking about, because they will bring up some good objections and some good questions and all that. So I'm constantly looking for good stuff.
Yeah, definitely, Kevin. I just want to say again, if you're listening live, we will take a few questions. If you have questions, feel free to add them. I'm curious, have you guys like looked at like answering like YouTube videos? I feel like it's like to be like get your YouTube atheist like badge, you have to at least respond to a couple of Dr. Craig's arguments. So like, have you looked at like responding to YouTube videos at all?
Yeah, and we've if you'll go back to the podcast, you'll see that we'll go through some of the shorter videos, and we can't do a podcast. Well, it would take forever to do some of the longer ones, but
Yeah.
I'll try to get to the meat of some of those. But we'll watch a podcast, a video together, and then pause it at different times and let Dr. Craig comment. And so we are doing that. Dr. Craig has long been known, and he's been heavily criticized for it, but it's pretty routine. It's pretty par for the course that when you have two PhDs, that the vast majority of the time that you schedule a debate or an interaction is going to be with someone who is also credentialed, who also has their PhD and so on. That doesn't mean that people who don't have that aren't knowledgeable and would be great at a debate. But Dr. Craig has tried to hold his formal debates with colleagues and with people who have got those credentials, and it's kept people from saying, well, of course you mop the floor with him because you got a PhD and he didn't get past the 10th grade or whatever. But the podcast have given us some opportunities to interact with some popular atheist bloggers who, and they're not credentialed. They don't have their PhDs and things like that. Just knowledgeable, just very, very popular, like Matt Dillahunty, very popular.
Huge impact.
And, speaker and interactor. And that will give us an opportunity to interact with some of these individuals who would like to debate Dr. Craig. But again, Dr. Craig he has that policy for the most part about who he will debate and so on. But that will give him a chance to interact. And so we've interacted with some of the popular atheists out there, Matt Dillahunty, Dan Barker, and some others.
Awesome. One more question here, and we'll hit a couple live questions. Earlier, you talked about the discipline, like working with Dr. Craig for yourself, and just seeing that in his own life with his wife Jan. So, like, what does that discipline look like for you guys? Because it seems like he does a lot, and you guys do a lot as a team. So, like, what's that discipline look like?
Well, I'll tell you what, I have had to. He is extremely disciplined, and he gets up early in the morning, and the first thing he does is spend time with God every morning, and that's been an inspiration to me. And he will do things read things strictly for devotion, because you can get into this, deal where you're just reading everything for intellectual learning and cataloging and equipping yourself, and sometimes the devotion and sometimes just the joy of it can go right out the window. So we make sure that doesn't happen. He'll do that first, and then he'll get to the serious work. But I've had to be on time, and I'm a musician and a radio guy, and so I'm used to staying up all night and not being anywhere on time. So Dr. Craig has been very patient with me, but he's also helped me to get my act together and to get, and get things done, get things happening. And so we've had some pretty comical moments of him saying, "Now, Kevin, you need to get disciplined."
I don't even know if Dr. Craig has like a serious angry voice. I don't know if that's possible.
Oh, he doesn't. He's never lost his I don't think he's got a temper. He's the real deal. He's great, but he can be firm, obviously. But he feels the weight of his platform. He doesn't take it lightly. And so I've had to work really hard to get his sense of humor out, because he's so, dead set on getting these podcasts straightened, and so many people are listening, and he just feels the weight of how popular he's gotten, and everybody wants a piece of him as far as debate and take him on, and he's had to have develop a thick skin because people have made personal attacks. I mean, I'm researching these podcasts, and there's a huge amount of material that I have to wade the sewer that I have to wade through that are nothing but personal attacks against him. And yet at the same time, you'll also find some of the people who disagree with him who are so gracious toward him and respect him and treat him as a colleague. But boy, the vitriol has just been really bad, at times. And I've had to, not let that get to me and get out of there fast. I mean, if I'm reading something and it's nothing but personal attacks, I'm bailing. I'm not going to sit there and read it and get depressed over it. But did that answer the question? I'm trying
to remember what I originally asked, but it answered something that was really good. Yeah, we were talking about discipline and stuff. So
yeah,
that was really great.
Yeah, it's important.
Discipline is important. We'll go to a little bit of Q&A or comments or things like that. We have Will Craig here, obviously not William Lane Craig, but Will Craig, PhD math student, doing really good work. We had him on a little bit. He's talking about the argument for mathematics and really interesting stuff that Dr. Craig is working on there. But he says, as another person named William Craig, I'd love to do so much as to do a discussion trying to pin down the role of young people, the role young people can play in academia or other young people issues. So, what do you think the role of young people is in the future of apologetics and these big questions?
I'm just amazed how many young people there are who are just electrified and energized by apologetics. There was a time that in the 90s, and when everything was first starting on the internet, that some atheist or some opponent of Christianity would put up some objection, and I felt the pressure. If I didn't answer it, nobody would, and it would just be out there. And nowadays, there will be 15 people give it an answer. Yeah. And some of them are in the 6th grade. So, and they're great. They have a lot of knowledge, and it's like younger and younger. And again, you need this area. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so you don't want to leave this out and just be all touchy-feely. We've gone through an anti-intellectual, just touchy-feely era in the American church, in the Western church. And we're coming out of that and knowing that it's not just all emotional and feelings, but there is an intellectual grounding to our faith that is extremely important. And so young people need to have that grounding, and they can have all the emotion too, and the fun and the music, the worship music, and that. But I see some churches, some denominations, it's all feeling. And it's all personal experience, and it's all emotion. You have to conjure up this emotion and work yourself up into this emotional state, or you're not very, or you're not worshiping, you know. And so I don't want to see that ever. I don't want to see that happen. I want to see young people stay intellectually grounded. But we've seen an apologetics renaissance. It's been amazing, and people go, "Oh man, are you kidding me?" Starting in 2001, we've seen a huge atheist movement, and I'm going, "Yeah." And guess when Dr. Craig hit? And guess when Norman Geisler and Ravi Zacharias and Josh McDowell and all these guys were happening? 70s, 80s, and 90s. How bad would the atheist movement have run roughshod over the church if that intellectual grounding was, man, you look back in retrospect and going, God knew what he was doing with this big intellectual movement, because 2001, 9/11 happened. Four horsemen of the atheist four horsemen, you know, Dawkins and all, started writing the books, Sam Harris. And just think how bad it would be if there hadn't been this pre-grounding of all this going on. And so the timing has been really cool, you know.
Yeah. We'll go to probably one more question here due to time, but it's a question. It says, did you come across a book or something that was able to help you navigate through the pain with having lost a son? I had a similar loss in 1982. Susan, thank you for your question, and thank you for sharing.
Bless your heart. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I don't know. It's been several years, Susan. I wish I could. I do want to recommend, if you haven't, some C.S. Lewis, and read about his grief when he lost his wife, and some of the things that he's written. There's a lot of good stuff out there about the grieving process. And again, we do grieve, but we don't grieve without hope. Death is a painful celebration, but it is a celebration because of the resurrection of Jesus. But I can't think of it. There is some good grief material out there. I can't think of it right now, but I do want to commend to you. Read some C.S. Lewis and read some of the things that he has said. I think you'll get a lot out of it.
C.S. Lewis is always a great way to go. We'll close with one more question here. We'll probably be done with questions now for the sake of time. But I'm curious, just kind of to wrap this up on like a fun note. Do you have like a funny story in working with Dr. Craig, or like an embarrassing story or something along those lines that people can take away, maybe just get a laugh out of to wrap things up here?
Well, I've been thinking about it, and he's such an egghead that I can't ever get anything funny out of him very much. You appreciate me saying that. No, we do laugh a lot. He thought I was. I've got this weird sense of humor. He thought I was crazy for a long time, but he's finally warmed up to me, and now I make him laugh a lot. Being in entertainment radio, you know, I tend to come up with the lines, but one of the funniest things that he does is he and his wife Jan, and I cannot say enough about her. Oh man, what a blessing. They have such a good relationship, and they're an inspiration. They're a model for me. They have a fantastic relationship, but they call each other these syrupy names like lambkins and honeypot, sweet treat, and I'm just like, oh, you guys get a room. But it's just you'll get cavities being around them, but they're just very affectionate and loving. But where they came up with some of these nicknames for each other, I can't even keep up with all the nicknames. Lambkins, you know, bubble gum, I don't know. And so but they're very they use all these pet names for each other. And I always crack up because it seems like there's a whole new set of names that they call each other when he calls her, or we go out to dinner, or whatever. And by the way, guys, I think your wife will probably really appreciate that. Call her by some pet names, because it certainly works with Jan, and secret weapon with my wife as well. So I try to come up with some original ones. And the only other funny story was when I had Dr. Craig and I were at a speaking engagement. I picked him up in this dilapidated car of mine that shook. You know, I mean, the wheels were out of line. I picked him up, and he's hanging on for dear life, you know, as I'm picking him up at the airport. And we're going down the road just shaking and trying to talk about Alvin Planet, you know, and he never has gotten over that car. Thankfully, I got rid of it, but I shook him up good, you know, in that car. And he again, he's been very patient with me. Other than that, it's all business, you know.
It's amazing. I just want to say thank you so much, Kevin, for your time. I've learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else listening has. They left here a little bit inspired. So much great stuff that you brought, not just about Dr. Craig, but in your own life and how God's been using you through your story. So I really appreciate your honesty and your time. It's been really amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want these podcasts to get better and better. I'm trying to find a way to really go full time doing this podcast, because shows like yours and other channels are becoming more and more sophisticated. And I'm an old guy, so I got to keep up with all this stuff and make sure I know how to do a green screen and all that kind of stuff, you know, these days.
Yeah.
And so hopefully you'll see some good stuff. But Dr. Craig is doing great, and we're going to be hearing from him for a long time.
That's great to hear. We're all looking forward to it. I want to say, as always, thank you everyone for tuning in to Adherent Apologetics. I really encourage you to check out the Reasonable Faith podcast if you haven't already, though I'm sure if you're listening to this, I'm sure you've stumbled upon that at some point. So thank you again for everyone for tuning in. I'd encourage you, if you're new, be sure to subscribe, whether you're listening via podcast or YouTube. Really appreciate it. You can leave a like, you can leave a rating. So I want to say thank you to everyone tuning in, BDS, the programmer, Slam RN, everyone else. Lots of great questions. Glad we got to get through a few. And as always, I'm saying thank you to everyone who supports the show. You can support the show if you don't at patreon.com/AdherentApologetics. We're about a little over 70% funded. So I appreciate everyone's support. Susan, Roger Sharp, Bible Dinkers, Chris Matthew, everyone else, so many people. Thank you so much. And once again, a final thank you again to Kevin for coming on. So much great information. I really appreciate your time.
Zach, thank you. Keep up the good work. Thanks for doing this.
You too, Kevin. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in once again